Hey guys, it's Nicole and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to spotlight one of my favorite species, the Phalaenopsis Hieroglyphica. Now, I find this orchid very easy to grow for a species type orchid. It's not too fussy, and ever since I got it about a year and a half ago, it's pushed out about 8 different spikes and it's given me dozens of blooms. So I'll talk to you about its care and culture and how I grow it here in my apartment in New York City. The Phalaenopsis Hieroglyphica is native to the islands of the Philippines, and you could find it in the shady parts of the rainforest there. This environment is usually very humid, and what this means is that it doesn't need a ton of light to bloom. I personally have mine in moderate lights. I grow it under artificial light, and it's doing very well. So it doesn't need anything like a Cattleya or a Vanda would. This is a medium-sized orchid, and as you can tell, it tends to hold on to a lot of its leaves. What I really like about it as well is that it is capable of producing many different spikes. So I got this about a year and a half ago from Hauserman Orchids, and it's got about 8 different spikes right now, which is fantastic. You don't get that with some of the more complex hybrids. In its natural habitat, these guys usually bloom in the spring, but for me, it usually blooms in the winter. And because I grow indoors, it's sort of kind of warm all the time indoors, so I can see why it's blooming outside of schedule when it's outside of its natural environment. This is one of my favorites because it has a very, very fuzzy lip, and I just love that about it. Every bloom is a little bit different, and the spotting is unique to every single bloom. Now, I wish this orchid had a fragrance. Mine doesn't, but some might. I've heard of some stories of some folks with some hieroglyphicas that are fragrant. So let me know down in the comments if you have one of these and if it's fragrant for you. This is a warm to hot grower, and it appreciates staying on the warmer side, which makes sense given that it lives closer to the equator in the wild. In terms of humidity, it normally gets 80 to 90%, which is incredibly high. If you have those sort of conditions, you'd be able to grow this orchid mounted. However, if you live in an indoor environment, I recommend potting it up in something that's going to maintain a lot of moisture around the roots, and I personally grow it in sphagnum moss topped with some bark, and it's doing very well in that setup for me here in New York City. This is an orchid that you don't want to let dry too much, so I water it as it's approaching dryness, but the media stays quite moist. And that means that I have to repot it every year. So I'll be repotting it in the spring and giving it some new fresh moss. I feed this orchid just like I do the rest of my collection. I only make exceptions for resting orchids such as catasetums and dendrobiums, and catasetums in the growing season, which get slow release fertilizer. So in terms of how I'm feeding it, it gets about 300 parts per million in the summer, and that's when it's growing vegetatively and pushing out loads of roots. And in the winter, I give it about 150 parts per million. I feed it while it's blooming because sometimes it's working on leaves and it's pushing out new roots, so it's constantly growing for me. This orchid doesn't have a rest period, and it's best to repot it once the blooms are done. This has sequential blooms, so it'll be blooming for a while, so when these fade, there will be more blooms that come off and branch off the old spikes. So the spikes that it has right now are the same spikes that it had last year, and they just branched out. So don't cut the spikes when they're done blooming. Since this is a species, it is capable of just pushing more flowers. So that's something to keep in mind that's different from other Phalaenopsis orchids. I really like this orchid. I think it's just the fuzzy lip that really gets me. I find it beautiful and very easy to grow. Let me know down in the comments if you have this one, and I'm very curious to hear if you guys have fragrance on yours. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time. Bye, everyone.